Most of the variables you deal with when you write Excel VBA code will be single variables, such as item prices, shipping rates, and so on. However, if you must deal with a set of values of the same type, such as a set of shipping rates, you can do so by creating an array. In this worksheet, I have a set of 6 shipping rates, and they're all based on weight. So a 5-pound package will cost $10, a 10 will cost you $20, and so on. Now let's see how I represent those values in an array in Excel VBA. To move over to the Visual Basic Editor, I'll press Alt F11. And here I have a subroutine that will load values into a one-dimensional array. You define an array like you would any other variable using a dim statement and then the name of the variable. The difference is that you have the number of values that you want within the parentheses to the right of the value. In this case, I have the number 5. Something to keep in mind, though, is that in Excel and the other Microsoft Office programs, when you write in VBA, when you create an array, the program starts counting from 0 as opposed to 1. So I had 6 shipping rates in my worksheet, and in this case, I put down the number 5 because the array items will be numbered from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 to 5. So now that we've defined the array, how do we populate it? That is, how do we assign each of the array members a value? To do that, you either assign the rates to each element by typing the values into your code module, or you can read the values from a group of worksheet cells. For example, in the worksheet I showed you earlier, flipping back using Alt F11, have values in cells C3 through C8. When I switch back to the Visual Basic Editor, you can see that I'm using this code here to read the values into the array. The first thing I do is select cell B3, and then I step through each of the shipping rates and write that value to an array member. I'm using the counter variable, and I'm starting at 0 and going to 5, and I'm reading the values from the worksheet. With this statement here, shipping charges with the counter variable, I'm assigning a value that is offset from cell B3 by this number of rows and 1 column. Let me switch back to the worksheet to show you what that looks like. Pressing Alt F11. So I'm starting here on cell B3. The first time I go through the loop, Excel will look at the value 1 column to the right and 0 rows down. Again, I'm counting from 0 to 5. So I shift down by the first number, which is 0 rows. That means that the first array item will receive the number 10. When we go through the loop again, it will assign the second array item the value that is 1 column over and 1 row down. So that will be the value of 20. And the loop will continue on throughout. If I switch back to the VBA code, you can see that I have it going from 0 to 5. And then below, I count from 0 to 5 again, and I have a message box that will display the value of each one of the elements in the array. I can run the code by pressing F5. The first element is valued 10, which is correct, 20, 30, 40, 45, and 50. Another way to assign values to an array is by defining the array variable as a variant and assigning the values using statements such as the following. Here, I've created a ship types array that contains 4 elements. Again, we start from 0. So we would count 0, 1, 2, 3, ending up with 4 elements. And then I can use this command here. I type the name of the array, but without the parentheses or any number behind it. =, and then the statement array, parentheses, and then I have a list of each of the values that would be going into the array. The values I'm writing into the array are strings, so I place them in double quotes. So those are how you create arrays with only one dimension. You can also create arrays that have more than one dimension. The best way to visualize a 2-dimensional array is to think of an Excel worksheet grid. Press Alt F11 to come back. You can describe every cell in a worksheet using 2 values, a row number and a column letter. Similarly, you can create a 2-dimensional array that holds the values for shipping rates based on weight and the distance the package must travel. I have that sort of data on sheet 2. If there were 6 weight categories, indicated here along the top, and 10 zones, indicated here along the left, you could create a 2-dimensional array using the statement that I'll show you now. That is shipping charges, 5, 9. Again, we start counting from 0. So the first dimension, which are the weight categories, we need 6 items. So we have number 5, again, counting from 0. And for the number of zones, which is 10, we indicate by counting from 0 to 9. To read the values from the worksheet into the array, once again, we would need to step through each of the elements and write them into the array. In this case, because there are 2 dimensions, we have to use 2 different counters, one going from 0 to 5, one going from 0 to 9, and each of the values is written to its corresponding value in the array. So far, all the procedures I've shown you assume you know how many items will end up in your array. But suppose you're creating an array from user input and you don't know how many items they'll enter. In that case, you can create a dynamic array and change the array's size using a redim statement later in the program. And that is the code that I have here in the charges dynamic array subroutine. To define a dynamic array, you use a statement such as this one, dim charges as a currency value, and you leave the parentheses open. That means that the array is undefined, and you can define the number of values that will be put into it. In this case, I am going to ask the user for some input on how many items they want to enter. So if I were to click inside the body of the subroutine and press F5, Excel displays an input box asking how many separate charges that the user wants to enter. In this case, I'll keep it simple. I'll just put in 2 and click OK. You could also press enter. Now, Excel redimensions the current charges array using the value that was derived from the input box. The input box put a value into the user response integer, and it is now being used to dimension the array. All of the procedures I've shown you assume that you know how many items will end up in your array. But suppose you're creating an array from user input and you don't know how many items they'll enter. In that case, you can create a dynamic array and change the array's size using a redim statement later in the program. I have a subroutine here that creates a dynamic array. To define a dynamic array, you use a statement such as this one, where I have dim charges as currency, and to the right of the variable name, I have an open and closed parentheses with no value in the middle. That indicates to Excel that it is an array. I just haven't defined how many values it's going to contain yet. So how do I find out how many elements I want to put in? I ask the user how many they want to enter, and I do that by assigning the variable user response to an input box that asks how many separate charges they want to enter. And again, because Excel starts counting from 0 when you build an array, you need to subtract 1 from that answer. So in other words, if the user were to type in 5, it would subtract 1, and the array elements would be numbered from 0 to 4. I'll show you how that works by pressing F5. Box asks how many separate charges to enter. Press 5, click OK, and Excel redimensions the array using the value that we just entered. And in this case, that value would be 4. If you redimension an array, Excel deletes the existing values in the array unless you use the preserve keyword after the redim keyword. And that command would just look like this. Redim, preserve, and now your existing values will be saved. Arrays help you maintain and look up data quickly without having to manipulate your worksheets. Maintaining these values in memory speeds up program execution and simplifies your programming job significantly.